Marcus Thompson sat on the cold concrete steps outside Lafayette Square, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee from a kind stranger. To everyone passing by, he was just another homeless man in Washington, D.C., invisible to the thousands of tourists and government workers who hurried past him daily. His gray beard was unkempt, his clothes were layered and dirty, and his eyes held the distant look that people associated with those who had lost everything. But Marcus wasn't who he appeared to be. 23 years ago, he had been Agent Marcus Thompson, one of the most decorated members of the Secret Service. He had stood guard over 3 different presidents, had taken a bullet meant for a foreign dignitary, and had prevented more assassination attempts than the public would ever know about. His reflexes were still sharp, his mind still tactical, and his training still intact beneath the facade of homelessness. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now sat begging for change just yards away from the White House, the very building he had once protected with his life. Every morning he would position himself on the same corner, watching the familiar patterns of security rotations, noting the faces of current agents, and observing the endless stream of visitors who came to gawk at the seat of American power. Most people avoided eye contact with him. Some dropped coins into his worn baseball cap without stopping. A few, usually tourists, would pause to take pictures, treating him like part of the Washington scenery. But Marcus noticed everything and everyone. He saw the subtle signs that others missed. The nervous businessman who walked the same route 3 times. The woman in the red coat who seemed to be photographing more than just the White House. The delivery truck that had been parked in the same spot for too long. His fall from grace hadn't happened overnight. After retiring from the Secret Service with full honors, Marcus had struggled to adapt to civilian life. The constant vigilance, the split-second decision-making, the weight of protecting the most powerful people in the world, it all left him with PTSD that went undiagnosed for years. His marriage crumbled under the strain of his nightmares and paranoia. His savings disappeared as he self-medicated with alcohol. Eventually, he lost his house, his car, and his dignity. For the past 5 years, Marcus had been living on the streets of D.C., moving between shelters and park benches. He had chosen to stay near the White House partly out of habit, partly out of a strange sense of duty that he couldn't shake, and partly because the familiar environment gave him some semblance of control in his chaotic life. The other homeless people in the area knew him as Tank, a nickname earned from his solid build, and his tendency to stand his ground when troublemakers tried to move him along. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, Marcus noticed something that made his trained instincts kick into high gear. A man in a gray suit had been conducting surveillance on the White House perimeter for the past 3 days, always arriving at 9:15 a.m. and leaving at 11:30 a.m. The man thought he was being subtle, pretending to read newspapers and check his phone, but Marcus recognized the methodical pattern of reconnaissance. The current Secret Service agents were too focused on obvious threats, the protesters with their signs, the tourists trying to climb the fence, the occasional drunk who got too close to the barriers. They weren't paying attention to the well-dressed man who blended in perfectly with the stream of business people and government workers. But Marcus was watching, and what he saw troubled him deeply. As the man in the gray suit made his rounds that morning, Marcus carefully observed his behavior. The stranger was timing something, counting steps and taking discreet photos with a device that looked like a phone but had too many buttons to be standard. This wasn't a tourist or a curious citizen. This was someone with training, someone with a plan, and someone who was very good at not being noticed. Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that he hadn't experienced in years. Every instinct honed over decades of protective service was telling him that this man represented a genuine threat. But who would believe a homeless man with a criminal record for vagrancy and public intoxication? Who would listen to someone that society had written off as a failure and a burden? The weight of his situation hit him like a physical blow. Here he was, possibly witnessing the early stages of a serious security threat to the White House, and he was powerless to act on it through official channels. He couldn't simply walk up to the Secret Service agents and explain what he'd observed. They would see his appearance, smell the alcohol on his breath from the night before, and dismiss him as just another mentally unstable homeless person seeking attention. As the morning wore on and the man in the gray suit continued his suspicious activities, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't use his old credentials or his former connections, but he still had his skills, his experience, and his unshakable commitment to protecting the office of the presidency. Even if he had to do it from the shadows, even if no one would ever know his name or acknowledge his service, he would find a way to investigate this threat and neutralize it if necessary. The homeless man that everyone ignored was about to become the most important guardian that the White House never knew it had. Marcus Thompson might have lost everything else, but he had never lost his sense of duty. And now that duty was calling him back into action in the most unlikely way possible. Marcus spent the rest of that Tuesday following the man in the gray suit from a distance, using skills he thought he'd never need again. Moving through the crowded streets of downtown Washington, he maintained visual contact while staying far enough back to avoid detection. The homeless appearance that had become his curse now worked as the perfect camouflage. Nobody paid attention to a vagrant shuffling along the sidewalks. The man led him through a complex route that confirmed Marcus's suspicions. This wasn't someone taking a casual stroll through the nation's capital. The stranger made several sudden turns, doubled back on his path twice, and stopped frequently to check for surveillance. All classic counter-surveillance techniques that Marcus recognized from his own training. Whatever this man was planning, he was a professional with serious training and resources. The trail ended at an upscale hotel 6 blocks from the White House. Marcus watched from across the street as the man entered through the main lobby. Noting the location and timing, he couldn't follow inside without raising suspicion, but he memorized every detail he could observe from his position on the street corner. The hotel was the kind of place that catered to foreign diplomats, wealthy tourists, and government contractors. Exactly the type of establishment where someone planning an operation would blend in seamlessly. That night, as Marcus huddled in a doorway near the hotel, he began to piece together what he'd observed. The man's surveillance pattern suggested he was mapping security rotations and identifying vulnerable windows of time. The sophisticated equipment disguised as everyday electronics indicated backing from a well-funded organization. Most concerning of all, the man's professional demeanor and careful planning suggested this wasn't some lone wolf with a grudge, but part of a larger, coordinated threat. Sleep came in fragments as Marcus's mind raced through possibilities and scenarios. His years of experience protecting high-value targets had taught him to think like an attacker, to identify weaknesses and exploit them before others could. Now he found himself in the strange position of conducting his own counterintelligence operation with no backup, no resources, and no official authority to act on what he discovered. The next morning, Marcus positioned himself strategically near the hotel entrance, pretending to panhandle while keeping watch. The man in the gray suit emerged at exactly 8:45 a.m., carrying a different briefcase and wearing slightly different clothes, but moving with the same purposeful stride. This time, instead of heading directly to the White House area, he took a circuitous route through downtown D.C., making stops at various government buildings and embassies. Following him proved more challenging in daylight with heavier foot traffic, but Marcus's years of experience served him well. He varied his own appearance by removing his outer jacket and changing his posture, basic techniques that helped him blend into different crowds as he tracked his target through the urban landscape. The man spent considerable time near the Treasury Building, the State Department, and several foreign embassies, always maintaining the same careful observation patterns. He took photos with his modified device, made notes in a small notebook, and conducted timing exercises that suggested he was mapping multiple targets, not just the White House. The scope of his reconnaissance was far broader and more sophisticated than Marcus had initially realized. During a break in his surveillance, while the man had lunch at an outdoor cafe, Marcus managed to get close enough to overhear fragments of a phone conversation. The man spoke in what sounded like accented English, possibly Eastern European, and mentioned something about the timeline moving up and confirmation from the other teams. The words chilled Marcus to the bone. This wasn't a single operative working alone, but part of a coordinated cell with multiple targets and a specific operational timeline. By afternoon, Marcus had gathered enough intelligence to know he was dealing with a serious imminent threat to national security. But his homeless status made it impossible to report his findings through normal channels. Any attempt to contact current Secret Service agents would be dismissed as the ramblings of a mentally unstable street person, even if he could prove his former credentials. His current circumstances would undermine his credibility. That evening, Marcus made his way to a public library that stayed open late, one of the few places where he could access a computer without paying. Using skills he'd learned during his federal training, he began researching the hotel where his target was staying, looking for patterns in recent bookings, and trying to identify other potential operatives. The slow internet connection and limited time frustrated him, but he managed to gather some useful information about the hotel's guest registry and recent unusual activity. As he worked, Marcus became aware that he was being watched. A woman at a nearby computer terminal kept glancing in his direction, and when he got up to use the restroom, she quickly moved to look at his screen. His paranoia from years of protective service kicked in, and he realized that if he had identified the man in the gray suit, it was possible that the surveillance network worked both ways. Leaving the library through a side exit, Marcus used every evasion technique he could remember to lose any potential tails. The irony struck him again. Here he was, a former federal agent conducting a shadow investigation while being hunted by the very people he was trying to stop. His homeless status had become both his greatest weakness and his most valuable asset, making him simultaneously invisible to authorities and undetectable to criminal surveillance. Back on the streets that night, Marcus realized he was running out of time. The man's mention of timeline moving up suggested that whatever operation was being planned would happen soon. He needed to find a way to warn the authorities without revealing himself, to protect the targets without reclaiming his former identity, and to stop a sophisticated threat using nothing but his wits and his decades of experience. The next morning would bring new challenges as Marcus prepared to take the biggest risk of his secret investigation. He had identified the threat, but now he had to find a way to neutralize it before innocent people paid the price for his inability to work within the system that had once been his life. Thursday morning brought an unexpected development that changed everything for Marcus. As he maintained his watch near the hotel, he spotted not one but 3 different operatives leaving the building at staggered intervals. The woman who had been watching him at the library was among them, confirming his worst fears about the scope of the operation he had stumbled upon. Each operative moved with the same professional efficiency as the original man in the gray suit, suggesting they were all part of a well-trained team. Marcus watched as they split up and headed in different directions throughout the city, each carrying similar modified equipment and following carefully planned routes. This wasn't just surveillance anymore. This was the final preparation phase before an active operation. Using techniques he'd learned during his federal training, Marcus managed to follow the woman through downtown DC without being detected. She led him to a series of locations that painted a terrifying picture of what was being planned. First, she conducted surveillance of the Capitol building, timing the movement of security personnel and photographing access points. Then she moved to Union Station, studying crowd patterns and exit routes. Finally, she spent over an hour near the Supreme Court, making detailed notes about visitor screening procedures. The pattern was clear to Marcus's trained eye. This wasn't an assassination plot targeting a single individual, but a coordinated attack designed to strike multiple symbols of American government simultaneously. The scope and ambition of the plan suggested backing from a major hostile intelligence service or terrorist organization with significant resources and planning capabilities. By noon, Marcus had identified at least 5 different operatives working throughout the city, each focusing on a different high-value target. They moved with the precision of a military unit, staying in contact through sophisticated communication devices and following predetermined schedules down to the minute. This level of coordination required months of planning, extensive financial backing, and access to detailed intelligence about U.S. security procedures. The weight of what he had discovered pressed down on Marcus like a physical burden. He was potentially the only person who had identified this threat, and the timeline for the operation appeared to be measured in days, not weeks. Every instinct developed over decades of protective service screamed at him to act, but his current circumstances made any direct action nearly impossible. That afternoon, Marcus made a desperate decision. He had to find a way to get his intelligence to someone who could act on it, even if it meant exposing himself and risking his own safety. Using his knowledge of Secret Service procedures, he began crafting an anonymous tip that would contain enough specific details to be taken seriously while protecting his identity. He returned to the public library and used their computers to research recent personnel changes in the Secret Service leadership, looking for someone who might remember his service record and be willing to listen to unconventional intelligence. After 2 hours of careful research, he identified Agent Sarah Chen, a current supervisor who had briefly worked under his command during the final years of his service. Crafting the message required all of Marcus's skill and experience. He needed to provide enough specific intelligence to prove the threat was real, without revealing how he had obtained the information. He detailed the locations where surveillance had been conducted, the timing patterns he had observed, and the physical descriptions of the operatives he had identified. Most importantly, he included tactical assessments that only someone with extensive protective experience would be able to provide. The message also contained subtle references to classified procedures and historical incidents that would prove to Agent Chen that the information came from someone with legitimate Secret Service background. Marcus hoped that these details would be enough to overcome any skepticism about receiving intelligence from an anonymous source. After sending the encrypted message through a secure email service, Marcus faced the agonizing wait to see if his warning would be taken seriously. He knew that even if Agent Chen remembered him favorably, the current security environment made law enforcement agencies suspicious of anonymous tips, especially ones that claimed knowledge of such a sophisticated operation. That evening, as Marcus prepared for another night on the streets, he noticed increased activity around several of the locations he had mentioned in his message. Plainclothes officers were conducting discreet surveillance near the Capitol building, and security at the Supreme Court appeared to have been quietly enhanced. His heart raced with the possibility that his warning had been received and acted upon, but his relief was short-lived. As he made his way back to his usual sleeping spot near Lafayette Square, Marcus became aware that he was being followed by multiple individuals who moved with the same professional efficiency as the operatives he had been tracking. Somehow his investigation had been discovered, and now he had become a target himself. The hunter had become the hunted, and Marcus realized that his anonymous tip might not have been as anonymous as he had hoped. Either his message had been intercepted, or there was a security breach within the federal agencies he was trying to warn. In either case, his life was now in immediate danger, and he would have to use every skill he possessed to stay alive long enough to see the operation disrupted, moving through the familiar streets. With the fluid grace of someone who had spent years evading detection, Marcus began to plan his next moves. He couldn't run away and abandon his responsibility to protect the targets he had identified, but he also couldn't continue his investigation if he was captured or eliminated by hostile operatives. The next 24 hours would test every aspect of his training and experience, as Marcus found himself fighting a shadow war in the streets of Washington, D.C., with the security of the nation hanging in the balance and no one knowing that a former Secret Service agent was all that stood between a terrorist cell and their targets. Friday morning found Marcus hiding in the underground maintenance tunnels beneath downtown Washington, D.C., a maze of service corridors that he had memorized during his years of presidential protection duty. The pursuit from the previous night had been intense and professional, confirming that the terrorist cell had discovered his surveillance and marked him for elimination. He had managed to evade capture by using his intimate knowledge of the city's hidden infrastructure, moving through utility tunnels, abandoned subway sections, and building maintenance areas that most people didn't know existed. His years on the streets had also taught him alternative routes and hiding places that even his former federal training hadn't covered. But hiding wasn't enough anymore. During the night, Marcus had intercepted radio communications suggesting that the terrorist operation had been accelerated in response to increased security activity around their targets. Instead of stopping the attack, his anonymous warning might have inadvertently caused the terrorists to move up their timeline, creating an even more dangerous situation. From his hiding place, Marcus used a stolen smartphone to monitor news reports and emergency service frequencies. What he discovered filled him with dread. There had been a series of small explosions at utility infrastructure sites around the city during the early morning hours. These weren't the main attacks, but rather diversionary strikes designed to draw security resources away from the primary targets. The pattern was brilliant and terrifying in its execution. By creating multiple smaller incidents, The terrorist cell was forcing law enforcement to spread their resources thin across the entire metropolitan area. Meanwhile, the main assault teams would have clearer paths to their high-value targets, while first responders were dealing with the diversionary attacks. Marcus realized that his anonymous tip, while taken seriously enough to prompt increased security measures, hadn't conveyed the full scope and sophistication of the threat he had uncovered. The authorities were treating this as a potential terrorist attack, but they weren't prepared for the level of coordination and tactical expertise that the cell was demonstrating. Using his knowledge of Secret Service protocols, Marcus began to piece together how the main attack would unfold. The diversionary explosions suggested a multi-phase operation, designed to create maximum chaos and symbolic impact. The terrorists weren't just trying to cause casualties, they were attempting to strike at the very foundations of American democracy by hitting multiple government institutions simultaneously. As morning progressed into afternoon, Marcus monitored emergency communications and noticed that security around the White House had been significantly increased, but the other potential targets he had identified were receiving less attention. This distribution of resources played directly into the terrorists' strategy, allowing them to focus their main assault on softer targets while the most heavily defended location drew the majority of protective resources. Marcus made the difficult decision to leave his hiding place and conduct one final reconnaissance mission. If the authorities weren't going to take his intelligence seriously enough to protect all the potential targets, he would have to gather more specific information about the timing and method of the planned attacks. Moving carefully through the city using techniques learned during decades of protective service, Marcus made his way to the areas around the Capitol building and the Supreme Court. What he observed confirmed his worst fears. The increased security presence was visible, but not comprehensive, and the terrorist operatives were still in position to carry out their planned attacks. Near the Capitol building, Marcus spotted the original man in the gray suit conducting final surveillance from a position that would give him clear sight lines to multiple approach routes. The operative's behavior suggested that the attack on this target was imminent, possibly within hours. At the Supreme Court, the woman from the library was coordinating with two other operatives Marcus hadn't seen before, using hand signals and predetermined positions that indicated a level of military training and operational experience. They were positioning themselves for what appeared to be a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm security through multiple simultaneous breaches. Most alarming of all, Marcus observed that the terrorists had acquired uniforms and credentials that would allow them to blend in with legitimate security personnel during the chaos of their attack. This level of preparation suggested either extensive insider knowledge or successful penetration of federal security systems. By late afternoon, Marcus had gathered enough intelligence to understand the full scope of the planned operation. The attacks would begin with diversionary explosions to draw away emergency responders, followed by coordinated assaults on the Capitol building and Supreme Court using operatives disguised as security personnel. The timing was designed to coincide with high-profile sessions at both locations, maximizing both casualties and symbolic impact. But Marcus also realized that his continued surveillance had been detected. The terrorists were now actively hunting him with the same professional efficiency they were applying to their main operation. He had become a threat to their mission that needed to be eliminated before they could proceed with the final phase of their plan. As evening approached, Marcus found himself in an impossible situation. He possessed critical intelligence that could prevent a catastrophic terrorist attack, but he was being hunted by professional killers who would stop at nothing to protect their operation. His attempts to warn the authorities had been partially successful but not comprehensive, enough to prevent the attacks. The former Secret Service agent who had once stood ready to take a bullet for his country was about to face the ultimate test of his skills and dedication. With no backup, no resources, and no official authority, Marcus would have to find a way to single-handedly disrupt a sophisticated terrorist operation while staying alive long enough to see justice done. The next few hours would determine whether his years of training and sacrifice had prepared him for the most important mission of his life, one that no one would ever know he had undertaken, fighting enemies who didn't even know his name. Saturday evening brought the moment Marcus had been dreading and preparing for simultaneously. Through intercepted communications and careful observation, He had determined that the terrorist attacks would commence at exactly 6:30 p.m., timed to coincide with special evening sessions at both the Capitol building and the Supreme Court. The symbolism was deliberate, striking. At American democracy, when the institutions were actively in session, Marcus positioned himself in a maintenance area beneath the Capitol building, using access routes he remembered from his years of protective service. His plan was desperate but simple. He would have to physically disrupt the terrorist operation from within, using his knowledge of the building's layout and security systems to turn the attackers' own coordination against them. Above him, he could hear the normal sounds of government business proceeding, completely unaware of the threat that was minutes away from materializing. Senators, representatives, staff members, and visitors were going about their evening routine, protected by security measures that Marcus knew would be insufficient against the level of sophistication the terrorists had demonstrated. At 6:15 p.m., Marcus began moving through the building's service corridors, heading toward the positions where he had observed the terrorists conducting their final preparations. His heart pounded with the familiar pre-mission adrenaline he hadn't felt in years, but his hands were steady and his mind was clear. This was what he had been trained for, even if the circumstances were unlike anything he could have imagined. The first terrorist he encountered was positioned near a utility access point that would allow him to bypass several layers of security and emerge directly into the main legislative areas. The man was dressed as a Capitol police officer, with credentials and equipment that appeared completely authentic. Marcus realized that the level of preparation included not just uniforms and badges, but detailed knowledge of security protocols and shift schedules. Using skills honed over decades of protective service, Marcus approached silently from behind and disabled the terrorist with a chokehold that rendered him unconscious without alerting others. He quickly stripped the man of his communication device and weapon, gaining access to the terrorist network's operational frequency. What Marcus heard through the earpiece chilled him to the bone. The operation was even larger than he had realized, with coordinated teams preparing to strike not just the Capitol building and Supreme Court, but also the Treasury building and several foreign embassies. The diversionary explosions earlier in the day had been just the beginning of a massive assault on the symbols of American government and international relations. Moving deeper into the building, Marcus used the captured communication device to monitor the terrorists' coordination while working to disrupt their positions one by one. His knowledge of the Capitol's layout gave him a crucial advantage, allowing him to move through areas that the attackers hadn't anticipated being accessible. The second terrorist he encountered was positioned near the main electrical systems, apparently preparing to cut power to critical security systems at the moment the attack began. Marcus realized that the coordination extended beyond just the assault teams. The terrorists had planned to cripple the building's defensive capabilities from within before the main attack commenced. This operative proved more alert and better trained than the first. A brief but intense fight ensued in the narrow service corridor, with Marcus having to use every combat technique he had learned during his federal training. The confined space and need for silence made the encounter particularly challenging, but Marcus's experience and desperation gave him the edge he needed to prevail. With two operatives neutralized and their communication devices in his possession, Marcus began to understand the full timing and coordination of the planned attacks. The assault would begin with simultaneous breaches at multiple points, followed by coordinated movements toward specific high-value targets within each building. The terrorist had studied not just the physical layout, but also the behavioral patterns of security personnel and government officials. At 6:25 p.m., just 5 minutes before the scheduled commencement of the attacks, Marcus made a critical decision. Instead of continuing to hunt individual operatives, he would use his access to their communication network to create confusion and disruption from within their own coordination system. Using the captured radio equipment, Marcus began transmitting false commands and conflicting information to the terrorist teams. His knowledge of tactical communication protocols allowed him to mimic the speech patterns and terminology that the operatives would expect from their handlers, creating enough confusion to delay and disrupt their carefully timed coordination. The response was immediate and chaotic. Through the earpiece, Marcus could hear operatives asking for confirmation of conflicting orders, questioning whether their positions had been compromised. and expressing uncertainty about whether to proceed with the original timeline. The precision that had made their plan so dangerous was now working against them as they struggled to adapt to unexpected complications, but Marcus knew that his communication disruption would only buy limited time. The terrorist leaders would quickly realize that their network had been compromised and would either proceed with backup plans or abort the operation entirely. Either outcome could still result in significant casualties if he couldn't find a way to alert legitimate security forces to the immediate threat. Using his knowledge of Capitol building security systems, Marcus made his way to a central control room where he could access the building's emergency communication network. If he could trigger the right alarms and provide specific threat information to the security command center, he might be able to coordinate a proper response to the remaining terrorist operatives. As he worked frantically to access the emergency systems, Marcus became aware that his interference had been detected. The remaining terrorists were now actively hunting him within the building, and he could hear them coordinating their search through the communication devices he had been monitoring. The final phase of his desperate mission was about to begin. With Marcus trapped inside the Capitol building, hunted by professional killers, but closer than ever to preventing a catastrophic attack on American democracy. Everything would depend on whether he could stay alive long enough to complete his warning and ensure that the threat was properly neutralized. Marcus reached the Capitol building's security command center at exactly 6:32 p.m., just 2 minutes after the terrorist attack should have commenced according to their original timeline. His communication disruption had successfully delayed the operation, but he could hear through the captured radio devices that the terrorist leaders were attempting to regain control and proceed with modified plans. The command center was staffed by 3 Capitol Police officers who were monitoring routine security feeds, completely unaware of the immediate threat surrounding them. Marcus knew that his appearance, disheveled, dirty, and carrying stolen terrorist equipment, would make it nearly impossible to convince them of his legitimate intentions through normal means. Instead, he used his detailed knowledge of Capitol security protocols to demonstrate his credibility. Marcus provided specific information about current security rotation schedules, recent changes to emergency procedures, and classified details about protective measures that only someone with extensive federal law enforcement background would possess. The revelation that a homeless man outside the White House was actually a retired Secret Service agent initially met with skepticism, but the accuracy and specificity of his intelligence quickly convinced the officers that they were dealing with a genuine security professional. More importantly, the terrorist communication devices he carried provided undeniable proof that an active threat was present within the building. Within minutes, the command center became a hub of coordinated defensive activity. Marcus provided detailed descriptions of the operatives he had identified, their planned positions, and the overall scope of the coordinated attacks across multiple government buildings. His tactical assessment of the threat helped security commanders understand not just what they were facing, but how to effectively counter it. Emergency response teams were immediately dispatched to the positions Marcus had identified, while building-wide security alerts were activated to protect government officials and staff members. The advantage of surprise that the terrorists had counted on was completely eliminated, replaced by a coordinated defensive response that used their own intelligence against them. But the battle was far from over. As security teams moved to apprehend the identified terrorists, Marcus monitored their communications and realized that the operatives were implementing contingency plans designed for exactly this scenario. Instead of abandoning the operation, they were adapting to the changed circumstances and attempting to complete modified versions of their attacks. The woman from the library, who had been coordinating operations at the Supreme Court, had successfully evaded the initial security response and was attempting to reach a fallback position where she could still cause significant damage. Through the intercepted communications, Marcus learned that she had acquired explosives and was planning a suicide attack that would cause maximum casualties even if the broader operation failed. Marcus made the critical decision to leave the relative safety of the command center and pursue this final threat personally. His knowledge of Washington, D.C.'s interconnected building systems and utility tunnels gave him the best chance of intercepting the operative before she could reach her target. The Capitol Police commanders were reluctant to let their unexpected intelligence asset leave, but Marcus convinced them that his unique knowledge and mobility were essential to preventing the final phase of the attack, racing. Through the underground passages that connected government buildings throughout the downtown area, Marcus used the terrorist communication devices to track the woman's movement while coordinating with security teams above ground. The chase took him through maintenance tunnels, subway connections, and building basements in a desperate attempt to reach the Supreme Court. Before the suicide bomber could complete her mission, the pursuit led Marcus through areas of the city's infrastructure that few people had ever seen, including Cold War-era emergency tunnels and modern fiber-optic communication corridors. His years on the streets had given him additional knowledge of these hidden spaces, creating a mental map that proved invaluable during the high-speed underground chase. As he emerged near the Supreme Court building, Marcus could see that security teams were already in position around the perimeter, but they were focused on preventing entry rather than stopping someone who might already be inside. The terrorist operative had demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of building layouts and security procedures, suggesting that she might have found alternative access routes that weren't being monitored. Through his earpiece, Marcus heard the woman communicating with what appeared to be a handler located outside the United States, confirming that this was indeed an international terrorist operation with significant backing and coordination. The conversation revealed that even if this particular attack failed, it was part of a larger series of operations planned for cities across America. Marcus realized that capturing this operative alive had become crucial not just for preventing immediate casualties, but for gathering intelligence about the broader terrorist network and preventing future attacks. His mission had evolved from simple threat disruption to counterintelligence, gathering that could protect thousands of lives across the country. As he approached the Supreme Court building through underground access routes, Marcus prepared for what he knew would be the most dangerous encounter of his career. The terrorist operative was cornered, heavily armed, and prepared to die in order to complete her mission. Everything would depend on his ability to use decades of training and experience to end the threat while preserving the intelligence value of capturing rather than killing his target. The homeless man who had started this journey as an invisible observer was about to become the key to unraveling an international terrorist conspiracy that threatened the very foundations of American democracy. Marcus emerged into the Supreme Court building through a maintenance access point, just as the terrorist operative was making her final approach to the main courtroom where an emergency session was in progress. The timing was critical. She was less than 2 minutes away from a position where her explosive device could cause catastrophic casualties among some of the most important figures in American jurisprudence. The confrontation took place in a marble-lined corridor beneath the main floor of the Supreme Court, an area that amplified every sound and offered limited cover. Marcus approached silently, using techniques perfected during decades of protective service. But the operative's training was evident in her awareness of her surroundings and preparation for exactly this type of intervention. When she detected his presence, the woman turned with a weapon already drawn, leading to a tense standoff in the confined space. Marcus could see the explosive device she carried, sophisticated, compact, and clearly designed to cause maximum damage in the confined space of the courtroom above. Her eyes held the cold determination of someone prepared to die for her cause, but also the tactical awareness of a professional who wouldn't make careless mistakes. Using his knowledge of terrorist psychology and negotiation techniques, Marcus attempted to engage her in conversation while positioning himself for a potential takedown. He spoke in calm, measured tones about the futility of her mission, now that the broader operation had been compromised, hoping to create doubt or hesitation that he could exploit. The operative proved to be highly trained and ideologically committed, but Marcus's years of experience allowed him to detect subtle signs of uncertainty in her responses. She had been prepared for many contingencies, but not for the level of specific intelligence that had been used to disrupt their carefully planned operation. The fact that someone had penetrated their security and communications so thoroughly was clearly troubling to her professional assessment of the situation. As they spoke, Marcus became aware through his earpiece that security teams were closing in on their position from multiple directions. The challenge now was preventing the operative from detonating her device in response to the approaching threat, while also ensuring that she could be captured, alive to provide intelligence about the broader terrorist network. The breakthrough came when Marcus realized that the operative was receiving conflicting instructions through her own communication device. Her handlers were apparently divided about whether to proceed with the suicide attack or attempt to preserve the asset for future operations. This confusion created the opening that Marcus needed to act decisively. Using a combination of tactical deception and physical intervention, Marcus managed to disarm the operative and neutralize the explosive device without triggering a detonation. The takedown required every skill he had developed over his career, combining hand-to-hand combat techniques with explosive ordnance procedures and hostage negotiation strategies. Within minutes, FBI counter-terrorism teams had secured the area and taken the operative into custody. The intelligence gathered from her capture, combined with the communication intercepts Marcus had provided, led to a coordinated international operation that disrupted terrorist cells in 6 different countries and prevented dozens of planned attacks across the United States. In the aftermath of the operation, Marcus found himself in the surreal position of being debriefed by federal agents in the same buildings he had once protected as a member of the Secret Service. His intelligence had not only prevented a catastrophic attack on American government institutions, but had also provided the foundation for dismantling a sophisticated international terrorist network. The official recognition came quietly. As such things often do in the intelligence community, Marcus was offered reinstatement to federal service, financial compensation for his years of hardship, and official recognition for his extraordinary service to national security. But perhaps more importantly, he was offered something that had been missing from his life for years, a sense of purpose and the knowledge that his skills and experience still had value. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson was no longer homeless. He had accepted a position as a security consultant, working with federal agencies to identify vulnerabilities in protective procedures and training programs. His unique perspective, combining official federal experience with years of observing society from its margins, proved invaluable in developing more comprehensive security strategies. The homeless man who had once been invisible to everyone walking past him on the streets of Washington, D.C. had become one of the most important intelligence assets in the fight against terrorism. His story remained classified, known only to a select few within the intelligence community, but his contribution to national security was immeasurable. Marcus still sometimes walked past Lafayette Square, remembering the years he had spent there and the observation skills that had saved countless lives. He had learned that sometimes the most important guardians are the ones that nobody sees, and that service to country can take many forms, even when it means operating completely alone in the shadows. The man who everybody ignored had become the person who saved them all, proving that heroism often comes from the most unexpected places, and that the most important battles are sometimes fought by those who receive no recognition for their sacrifice. Marcus Thompson had found his way home, not to a place but to a purpose that gave meaning to everything he had endured.